At New Year's Eve, my son raised a crystal glass, looked around the crowded living room, and said, "I hope this is Dad's last New Year's Eve in this house." The room burst into laughter. They thought it was a joke, a witty remark about an old man needing to downsize. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I just smiled quietly and took a sip of my drink. But the next morning, while my son was still sleeping off his expensive champagne, the FBI knocked on our front door. And the sheer, unadulterated terror on his face when they put him in handcuffs said absolutely everything. Before I continue with this story, I need to ask you something. Have you ever looked at the child you gave absolutely everything to, the child you bled for, and realized with a cold certainty that you have raised a monster? If you have ever had to stand up to a family member who underestimated your worth, hit the like button right now. And please tell me in the comments below, where are you watching from tonight? It brings me comfort, knowing I am not speaking into the void. Let me take you back to that night. The air inside my Bellevue lake house was warm, smelling of roasted meats, expensive perfumes, and the faint, crisp scent of the Washington pines drifting in from the open patio doors. It was a beautiful home. $2.5 million of prime real estate sitting right on the water, with floor-to-ceiling windows reflecting the shimmering lights of the city across the lake. But that night, it did not feel like my home. It felt like a stage, and I was merely an unwanted prop in my son's grand performance. Derek, my 38-year-old son, stood by the marble fireplace. He was wearing a custom-tailored Italian suit that cost more than my first truck. He held a glass of champagne that cost $200 a bottle. Next to him stood Monica, my daughter-in-law, draped in silk, adjusting her diamond earrings and broadcasting a fake, practiced smile to the room full of strangers. They were tech executives, investors, people who spoke in buzzwords and looked right through me as if I were part of the furniture. Derek was playing the gracious host, pretending that this mansion, this lifestyle, was all his own doing. Then came the toast. He clinked his glass with a silver spoon. The jazz music faded. The room fell silent. He talked about his successful year, his promotions, his brilliant investments. And then he turned his gaze to me, sitting quietly in my armchair in the corner. He flashed his perfectly white teeth and delivered that line. "I hope this is Dad's last New Year's Eve in this house." The guests chuckled, raising their glasses. Monica giggled, placing a manicured hand on Derek's chest. It was a humiliating, degrading moment disguised as light-hearted banter. But I saw the truth in his eyes. It was not a joke. It was a declaration. I looked down at my hands wrapped around my glass of sparkling cider. They are old hands. The skin is tough like worn leather. There is a deep, faded scar across my left thumb from a table saw accident 30 years ago. The knuckles are swollen from decades of gripping hammers, carrying lumber, and fighting the freezing Seattle rain. I am a retired general contractor. I did not buy this house with inherited wealth or phantom internet money. I built it, literally. I remember framing this exact living room. It was November. The wind was howling off the lake, biting through my thin jacket. My late wife Martha was standing right where Derek was standing now, holding a thermos of hot coffee, pregnant with him. I drove every single nail into these oak floors so that my unborn son would have a fortress, a home that would never leak a floor, that would never creak, a safe haven where he would never have to know the poverty I grew up in. I sacrificed my knees, my back, and my youth to build the very stage he was now using to humiliate me. I remember the nights Martha and I sat on the subflooring, eating cheap sandwiches, dreaming of the day our boy would run across these halls. When Martha got sick 5 years ago, I drained almost everything I had saved to pay for her treatments. I would have given my own heart if the doctors could have transplanted it into her. After she passed, this house was the only piece of her I had left. The walls still held the echo of her laugh. And now the son she gave her life to raise was trying to sweep me out the door like a pile of old dust. The laughter in the room slowly died down, and the jazz music resumed. I remained perfectly still. A younger man, a more foolish man, might have stood up, shouted, and demanded respect. He might have reminded the room that every brick, every pane of glass, every square inch of this property belonged to him. But at 70 years old, you learn that anger is a waste of energy. Anger tells your enemy exactly what you are thinking. Silence, however, makes them arrogant, and arrogance makes them sloppy. I watched Monica whispering into Derek's ear. She looked around the house not with the love of a family member, but with the cold, calculating eyes of a real estate appraiser. I had known for months that her lifestyle brand was failing. I had seen the past do notices she tried to hide in the trash. I knew Derek was desperate to maintain the illusion of their wealthy, flawless life on social media. They thought I was just a clueless old man, a relic from a forgotten era who did not understand modern finance, who could not comprehend their sophisticated world. They assumed my quiet demeanor was a sign of a failing mind. They mistook my patience for weakness. That is the greatest mistake a predator can make, underestimating the quiet survivor in the room. As the clock struck midnight and the fireworks exploded over the lake, painting the living room in flashes of red and gold, Derek came over and patted me firmly on the shoulder. "Happy New Year, old man," he said, his breath reeking of expensive alcohol. "We need to get you into a nice, quiet retirement community this spring. Somewhere with round-the-clock nurses. You are looking tired." I looked up at the boy I had given my soul, to the boy who was actively planning to erase me from my own life. "I am just fine, Derek," I replied softly. "Just enjoying the view." The party raged on into the early hours of the morning, but my mind was already sharpening itself for a war I never wanted to fight. I did not know yet about the documents hidden in his leather briefcase upstairs, but my gut told me that the ultimate betrayal had already begun. By 2 a.m, the Bellevue Lake House was finally silent. The last of the tech executives and venture capitalists had vanished into the cold Washington night. The jazz music was turned off, leaving only the sound of the winter wind howling off the lake and rattling the patio glass. I stood alone in the center of the living room, surrounded by the wreckage of my son's grand performance. Half-empty bottles of expensive champagne cluttered the marble countertops. Crumpled linen napkins and discarded plates covered the oak dining table that I had built with my own 2 hands. My back ached with a familiar dull throb radiating from my lower spine to my knees. It was a souvenir from 30 years of framing houses and pouring concrete. I began the slow, methodical process of cleaning up. I did not want to wake the maid service on a holiday, and frankly, I needed the physical labor to quiet my racing mind. I gathered the heavy glass bottles. The clinking sound echoed through the cavernous room. I wiped down the counters, scrubbed the stains from the hardwood, and restored order to the fortress I had built for my family. The physical work grounded me. It reminded me of who I was. I was not the useless old man they joked about. I was Harrison Bennett, a man who built his life from the ground up. After about an hour, the downstairs was pristine. I turned off the recessed lighting, plunging the lower floor into the soft, silvery glow of the moonlight, reflecting off the water outside. I began my slow ascent up the wide, carpeted staircase. The house was dead quiet. From the master suite at the end of the hall, I could hear the faint, rhythmic sound of Derek snoring. He always slept deeply after drinking. Monica was likely passed out beside him, dreaming of her next luxurious vacation. As I reached the top of the stairs, I turned toward the guest room where I now slept. Derek and Monica always claimed the master suite when they visited, casually pushing me into the smaller bedroom. I never complained. But tonight the hallway was unusually cluttered. Derek had left his overnight bag and his designer Italian leather briefcase sitting right in the middle of the corridor. The leather was sleek, polished, and reeked of sheer entitlement. I was tired. My vision was not what it used to be. As I walked past the mahogany console table, my heavy work boot clipped the edge of the briefcase. It was unlatched. The expensive bag tipped over, hitting the hardwood floor with a heavy thud. A thick stack of papers and folders slid out, fanning across the floorboards. I froze, holding my breath, waiting to see if the noise had woken my son. The house remained silent. The snoring from the master bedroom continued uninterrupted. I let out a slow sigh and knelt down on my aching knees to gather the spilled documents. Most of it was standard corporate nonsense. Spreadsheets, non-disclosure agreements, marketing pitches for his consulting firm. But as I reached for the last folder, my hand brushed against a heavy piece of cardstock. It was not a printed spreadsheet. It was an official envelope. The thick yellow paper felt rough against my calloused fingers. I turned it over in the dim light of the hallway sconce. My heart suddenly skipped a beat. The return address in the top left corner bore the official embossed seal of the King County Department of Assessments. But that was not what made the blood drain from my face. It was the name printed in bold black ink right in the center of the envelope. It was my name, Harrison Bennett. And right below my name, stamped in angry red letters, were the words, "Final Notice of Foreclosure." My hands began to tremble. I stood up slowly, clutching the envelope, and walked into the guest room, shutting the door quietly behind me. I turned on the small bedside lamp, the yellow light casting long shadows across the walls. I stared at the sealed envelope. It had already been torn open. Someone had intercepted my mail. I pulled out the thick stack of papers inside. The legal jargon was dense, but the numbers were painfully clear. The county was threatening to seize my property, this very house, and auction it off to the highest bidder in less than 30 days. The reason was catastrophic. According to the document, I owed $45,000 in unpaid property taxes and late penalties. I sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, the mattress groaning under my weight. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. There had to be a mistake, a massive bureaucratic error. I paid this house off completely 10 years ago. I remembered the exact day. Martha and I had opened a cheap bottle of wine and burned the final mortgage statement in the fireplace downstairs. We had celebrated our absolute freedom. Since then, my property taxes were always paid annually straight out of my retirement savings account. I had never missed a payment in my entire life. I am a man who checks his bank statements every single Friday. I know exactly where every penny of my money goes. I stared at the threatening numbers on the paper. $45,000. That meant the taxes had not been paid for over 3 years. But that was impossible. The county sends notices long before a final foreclosure. They send letters, they make phone calls, they leave warnings on the front door. I had received absolutely nothing. Not a single letter. Not a single phone call. And then the chilling reality washed over me like a bucket of freezing lake water. The letters had been sent. They had been arriving for months, maybe years, but I never saw them because someone else was getting to the mailbox first. Someone who had a key to my house. Someone who visited just often enough to check the mail when I was out fishing or running errands. I looked at the designer briefcase sitting out in the hallway through the crack in the door. The logic gap closed, snapping shut like a steel trap. The notice was not just randomly in my son's bag. He had taken it. Derek had been intercepting my mail. But why? Why would my own son hide a foreclosure notice from me? If I lost the house, he would lose his inheritance. None of it made sense. Unless the unpaid taxes were just a symptom of a much larger disease. Unless the money I thought was securely in my retirement account was no longer there. A deep, sickening knot twisted in my stomach. The boy I had raised, the boy I had built this home for, was hiding something massive. Something that could destroy my entire life and leave me homeless at 70 years old. My first instinct was violent. I wanted to march down the hallway, kick the master bedroom door off its hinges, drag Derek out of bed by his expensive silk pajamas, and demand the truth. I wanted to scream until my lungs gave out. I wanted to hold the paper to his face and make him explain why he was letting the county steal my home. I stood up, my fists clenched so tightly my fingernails bit into my palms. I took one step toward the door. Then I stopped. I remembered the arrogant smirk on his face during the toast. I remembered the cold, appraising look in Monica's eyes. If I confronted him now at 2 in the morning with nothing but an opened letter, he would lie. He would use his smooth corporate tongue to spin a story. He would say it was a mistake, that he was handling it, that he hid it to protect my health. He would cover his tracks, and whatever scheme he was running would disappear into the shadows, leaving me completely vulnerable. I took a deep, steadying breath. I walked back into the hallway, moving with the silent grace of a man who knows the creak of every floorboard in his house. I knelt beside the overturned briefcase. Carefully, meticulously, I slid the county notice back into its exact place among the corporate files. I arranged the spreadsheets precisely as they had fallen. I tipped the leather bag upright, leaving the latch undone, ensuring it looked exactly like an accidental spill that had not been touched. I stood up and looked toward the master bedroom. The snoring continued. He was sleeping the peaceful sleep of a man who thinks he has already won. I walked back to my room and turned off the light. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the darkness, watching the moonlight shift across the floor, waiting for the morning sun. Derek thought he was playing a game with a clueless old man. He had no idea that he had just handed me the rule book. He wanted me out of this house. But he was about to learn that you never pick a fight with the man who laid the foundation. The war had silently begun. The morning sun rose over Lake Washington, painting the sky in pale shades of winter gray and icy blue. The house was freezing, but the smell of roasted coffee beans drifted up the stairs, pulling me from the darkness of my room. I had spent the entire night sitting in the dark, calculating my next move. Before dawn, I had quietly used the small printer in my home office to make a crisp black and white copy of the foreclosure notice. I carefully returned the original to Derek's briefcase, leaving it exactly as I found it. Now, holding the freshly printed copy in my hand, I walked down the long hallway. As I entered the expansive kitchen, the morning light caught the reflection of the marble countertops. Derek was standing by the espresso machine. He was wearing an expensive cashmere sweater, looking fresh and completely unbothered by the heavy drinking from the night before. He was meticulously measuring out artisanal coffee grounds, acting like the lord of the manor. He did not notice me at first. He was humming a soft tune, completely immersed in his morning routine. It was the picture of domestic tranquility, a perfect illusion that I was about to shatter. I walked toward the kitchen island, my heavy work boots making soft thuds against the oak floorboards. My face was a mask of calm indifference. Inside, my heart was beating with a slow, heavy rhythm, like a war drum echoing in the distance. I stopped right across from him. The espresso machine whirred loudly, masking the sound of my approach, until I was practically standing over him. I did not raise my hand. I did not make a sudden, aggressive movement. I simply raised my right hand, holding the single piece of paper, and let it slip from between my fingers. The copy of the foreclosure notice fluttered through the air for a brief second, before landing flat on the polished marble counter with a soft, distinct slap. It slid right next to his perfectly measured cup of imported coffee. Derek paused. The humming stopped. His eyes darted down to the paper. For a fraction of a second, I watched his pupils dilate. The absolute silence of the kitchen pressed in on us. I stood perfectly still, my posture straight, letting the weight of the moment settle over his shoulders before I spoke a single word. I kept my voice perfectly level. There was no anger, no panic, just the cold, flat authority of a man who demanded an answer. "Derek," I said slowly, letting his name hang in the cold morning air. "Why does the county think I owe them $45,000 in unpaid property taxes?" I paused, watching the muscles in his jaw tighten just a fraction of an inch. "And more importantly, why was this final notice of foreclosure hidden inside your briefcase?" I waited. A normal person caught in a devastating lie would stammer. They would show fear, guilt, or at least surprise. But my son was not a normal person. He had spent years of summers in corporate boardrooms, learning how to manipulate investors and smooth over multi-million-dollar failures. He took a slow, deep breath, deliberately finished tamping his espresso grounds, and then finally looked up at me. He did not flinch. His face relaxed into a mask of mild, patronizing concern. It was a terrifying transformation, shifting instantly from a thief caught red-handed to a deeply caring son. He let out a gentle, dismissive sigh, as if I had just asked a foolish question about how to use a television remote. "Dad," he said, his voice dripping with practiced warmth. "I am so sorry you had to see that. I meant to tell you about it this afternoon." He leaned against the counter, crossing his arms casually. "There is a massive software glitch at the King County Tax Assessor Office. It has been all over the local business news. Their entire database crashed last month, and their automated system is sending out thousands of fake foreclosure notices to residents who do not owe a single dime. It is a complete administrative disaster." He smiled. It was a smooth, rehearsed smile that did not quite reach his cold, calculating eyes. "You know how these government agencies are, Dad. They update their servers once a decade, and when it breaks, innocent homeowners like you get these terrifying letters in the mail." I did not say a word. I just stared at him, letting him weave his web of deceit, memorizing every single detail of his beautifully constructed lie. He stepped closer, placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder. His palm felt heavy and entirely fake. "I saw the envelope sticking out of the mailbox when I arrived yesterday." He continued, his tone lowering into a whisper of fake intimacy. "I knew exactly what it was because a dozen of my clients received the exact same notice last week. I grabbed it and put it in my bag because I did not want you to see it and panic. You have been looking so tired lately, Dad. I did not want this ridiculous bureaucratic mistake to stress your old heart." He squeezed my shoulder, playing the role of the protective son flawlessly. "I was planning to take it to my tech firm tomorrow. I have my corporate legal team looking into this class action issue for my clients already. I was just going to have them clear your name from the system quietly. You do not need to worry about a thing. We will handle the county, and you can just focus on relaxing and enjoying your retirement." I let his words wash over me. The lie was brilliant. It was logical, comforting, and painted him as a savior. Any normal father would have hugged him, but I just looked deeply into his dark, lying eyes. I nodded slowly, pretending to believe his story. I was now completely, undeniably ready. I let a look of profound relief wash over my face. I forced my shoulders to drop, mimicking the posture of a tired old man who had just been saved from the brink of disaster. "Thank you, son," I said, making sure my voice trembled just enough to sound vulnerable. "What would I do without you?" I reached out and patted him on the back. His cashmere sweater felt soft, but the muscles underneath were rigid. He was tense. The smooth corporate facade was holding, but the physical body never completely masks the stress of a massive deception. "You are a good boy, Derek," I added, twisting the knife of my own sarcasm deep inside my mind. "I am just so glad you were here to intercept that awful letter." Right on cue, Monica glided into the kitchen. She had clearly been lingering in the hallway, listening to every word to make sure her husband had successfully neutralized the threat. She was wearing a matching designer lounge set, her hair perfectly styled despite it being so early in the morning. "Oh, Harrison," she cooed, her voice dripping with that unbearable artificial sweetness. "You know, we always have your back. Derek works so hard to make sure you are taken care of. We could not bear the thought of you sitting in this big, empty house worrying your poor heart over some silly computer mistake at the county office. Family takes care of family, right?" She walked over and wrapped her thin arms around me in a brief obligatory hug. She smelled of expensive floral perfume and stale champagne. I hugged her back, staring blankly over her shoulder at the shimmering water of the lake outside. "You are both so kind," I murmured. "I do not know how to repay you." Derek laughed, a loud, forced sound that echoed too sharply in the quiet kitchen. "Just keep making us those great holiday dinners, Dad," he said, turning back to his espresso machine as if the crisis had been entirely averted. Within an hour, they were packed and ready to leave. I stood on the front porch, the freezing morning air biting through my flannel shirt, watching them load their sleek black Tesla. Derek tossed the designer leather briefcase into the trunk, the very briefcase that held the undeniable proof of my impending ruin. He slammed the trunk shut, walked around to the driver's side, and gave me a final, confident wave. Monica blew me a kiss through the tinted passenger window. I waved back, maintaining the gentle, oblivious smile of a retired carpenter waving goodbye to his successful children. I watched the electric car glide silently down the long gravel driveway, turn onto the main road, and disappear behind a line of tall, evergreen trees. The moment the car was out of sight, my smile vanished. The heavy silence of the property returned, but it no longer felt peaceful. It felt like a crime scene. I turned and walked back inside the house. I locked the heavy oak front door and slid the deadbolt into place. I walked straight back to the kitchen. The room was empty, but the energy of Derek's deception still hung heavily in the air. I picked up the printed copy of the foreclosure notice that I had dropped on the marble island earlier. I folded it carefully and slid it into the front pocket of my jeans. Then I grabbed a damp cloth to wipe down the countertops. It was a habit Martha had taught me. Never leave a messy kitchen after guests depart. As I wiped the smooth, cold stone where Derek had been leaning during his masterful performance, my hand stopped. Right at the edge of the counter where he had casually braced himself, while explaining away the $45,000 debt, there was a distinct foggy smudge on the polished marble. I leaned in closer. It was a handprint. Not just a casual touch, but a thick, oily smear of sweat. I stared at it for a long time. Intuition is a funny thing. A father knows his son's tells. I remembered when Derek was 8 years old and broke a neighbor's greenhouse window with a baseball. He had stood in this very kitchen looking me dead in the eye, swearing he was entirely innocent. His voice had been steady. His gaze had been unwavering. But he had been gripping the edge of the dining table, and when he finally walked away, he left behind a pair of perfectly formed, sweaty handprints on the polished wood. Derek is a brilliant liar, but his nervous system always betrays him. He only gets sweaty palms when he is lying about something monumental. He was terrified. Not of the county, but of me finding out the truth. Have you ever caught someone in a lie just by reading their body language? Have you ever noticed that one tiny physical detail that exposes a massive betrayal? If you have, let me know in the comments below. It is amazing what people reveal when they think they are putting on a flawless performance. I took the damp cloth and slowly wiped his sweaty handprint off my counter, erasing the last physical trace of him from the room. The house was clean again. The lie had been told, and the trap had been successfully evaded in his mind. He was probably driving back to Seattle right now, holding Monica's hand, celebrating the fact that the clueless old man had bought the story hook, line, and sinker. They thought they had secured their timeline. They thought they had bought themselves enough space to finish whatever dark business they were conducting with my home as collateral. I walked over to the hook by the back door and grabbed my heavy canvas work coat. I reached into the ceramic bowl on the entryway table and pulled out the keys to my old Ford pickup truck. My hands were perfectly steady. My hands were perfectly steady. I pulled my phone from my pocket and sent a brief text message to my old friend Arthur. I told him I had a leak in the basement and would have to cancel our weekly Saturday morning fishing trip. It was a small lie, but today was not a day for catching trout on the lake. Today was a day for hunting the truth. I walked out the back door, the freezing January wind hitting my face, and climbed into my beat-up Ford F-150. The truck is almost 20 years old. The heater barely works and the engine grumbles like an angry bear waking up from hibernation, but it has never let me down. I turned the key. The engine roared to life, filling the quiet morning air with a cloud of white exhaust. I shifted into gear and drove down the gravel path, leaving my beautiful, quiet home behind me. The drive from Bellevue to the King County Records Office in downtown Seattle usually takes about 30 minutes if the traffic is light. Today, the roads were mostly empty, still hung over from the New Year festivities. I drove in absolute silence. No radio, no heater, just the cold air and the sound of my heavy tires on the asphalt. As I merged onto the highway, the route forced me to pass by the massive glass-fronted medical center where my wife Martha spent the last 6 months of her life. Every time I see that building, a heavy weight presses down on my chest. I took my foot off the gas pedal just a fraction, letting my eyes linger on the 4th-floor windows where her room used to be. 5 years ago, when the doctors gave us the diagnosis, I did not hesitate for a single second. I walked into my bank and drained every single penny of my retirement savings to pay for her experimental treatments. The insurance companies had turned their backs on us, claiming the procedures were unproven, but I did not care. I would have burned the entire world down just to give her one more month of life. When she passed away, I was emotionally shattered and financially ruined. At 65 years old, an age when most men are settling into their armchairs, I had to put my work boots back on. I spent the next 5 years taking on grueling contracting jobs, breathing in sawdust and pouring concrete with aching joints just to rebuild my savings from absolutely scratch. I did it because I had made a promise to Martha on her deathbed. I promised her I would never lose our home and that I would leave a legacy for our son, and now that very son was playing a dangerous game with the foundation I had bled twice to secure. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. The leather was worn thin under my palms. I thought about Derek's smooth, rehearsed smile in the kitchen. I thought about the sweaty handprint left on the marble counter. A software glitch. That was his story. A massive county-wide database failure that just happened to only target innocent homeowners and just happened to require him intercepting my mail to fix it. My mind turned the lie over and over, examining it from every angle. It was the kind of lie a desperate man tells when he thinks he is talking to a fool. He assumed my love for him would blind me to the glaring holes in his story. He believed that my old age meant my mind was slowing down, that I would just accept his words without a fight. I crossed the bridge into the city, the towering skyscrapers casting long, cold shadows over the highway. The King County Administration Building is a brutalist structure made of heavy concrete and dark glass, looking more like a fortress than a public office. I navigated the maze of downtown streets and pulled my battered Ford into a tight parking spot just a block away. I turned off the engine and sat in the quiet cab for a long moment. I looked at myself in the rearview mirror. My face was lined with deep wrinkles, a map of hard work and harder grief. My eyes were tired, but they were clear. I was not a senile old man. I was a father about to cross a line that could never be uncrossed. Once I walked through those doors and saw the official records, there would be no going back. The illusion of my happy family would be permanently broken. I stepped out of the truck, zipped up my heavy canvas jacket against the biting wind, and walked toward the entrance. The building was quiet, functioning on a skeleton crew for the holiday weekend. My heavy boots echoed loudly on the polished marble floors of the lobby as I followed the signs directing me to the Property Records Division. The room was sterile, brightly lit with fluorescent bulbs that hummed softly in the background. A single clerk, a middle-aged woman with thick glasses and a bored expression, sat behind a thick pane of security glass. I walked up to the counter. She did not look up immediately, continuing to type methodically on her keyboard. "Good morning," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet humming of the room. "I need to pull the complete property deed and financial history for my home address." The clerk finally looked up, adjusting her glasses. She let out a soft sigh, clearly annoyed by a customer so early on a holiday weekend. "I will need to see your government-issued identification, sir," she recited in a flat, monotone voice. I reached into my back pocket, pulled out my worn leather wallet, and slid my driver's license through the small metal slot beneath the glass. She took it, examined it for a moment, and then turned back to her computer screen. She took it, examined it, and turned back to her computer screen. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a low hum. I stood at the counter listening to the sharp clacking of her keyboard as she typed my information into the database. I was expecting a quick resolution. I expected her to pull up my file, see the spotless history of my tax payments, apologize for the automated error, and clear my name. I watched her face, waiting for the polite smile of bureaucratic apology. But that smile never came. Instead, the rhythmic clacking of her keyboard suddenly stopped. She leaned closer to her monitor, her brow furrowed into a deep frown. She scrolled down, clicked on something else, and then leaned back in her chair. When she finally looked up at me, the annoyance from earlier had completely vanished. It was replaced by pity. Absolute gut-wrenching pity. You never want to see that look on the face of a government clerk. It is the look they give right before delivering news that will destroy your life. I placed my hands flat on the cold marble counter. I understand there has been a glitch in your software system recently, I said, keeping my voice steady. My son told me. I just need you to clear the notice. The clerk slowly shook her head. Her voice was soft. Mr. Bennett, there is no software glitch. We have not had a system failure in over 4 years, sir. I am so sorry. Your property is currently in active foreclosure. I stared at her, the words floating like a foreign language. That is absolutely impossible, I stated firmly. I paid off the mortgage 10 years ago. I pay my property taxes every January. There is no debt on that property. She turned her monitor slightly. The foreclosure is not just about the unpaid property taxes, sir, she explained gently. The taxes have not been paid in 3 years, but the primary lien holder is a private bank. 6 months ago, a massive home equity line of credit was taken out against your property. The air in my lungs turned to ice. A home equity line of credit, a loan using my house as collateral. How much, I asked. She swallowed very hard. It is exactly $1.2 million, and the account is currently sitting in default. The floor felt as though it were dropping away. $1.2 million. My life savings wiped out and replaced by a mountain of debt so massive it suffocated me. My hands gripped the edge of the counter tightly. Someone stole my identity, I demanded, my voice rising in volume. Someone fraudulently took out a loan. Show me the paperwork. I want to see the original documents right now. The clerk nodded quickly, sending the file to the heavy industrial printer behind her desk. The machine spit out page after page of dense legal documents. She gathered the thick stack and slid it under the glass partition. I snatched it. My eyes scanned the complex banking terminology and loan agreements. I flipped frantically to the final page, the signature block, expecting to see a sloppy forgery by a complete stranger. What I saw stopped my heart dead in its chest. It was not a forgery. It was my signature. The loops of the H, the sharp slant of the B. It was undeniably my own handwriting. Right next to it was the official seal of a public notary. The loan was legally binding and signed by my own hand. I staggered back the heavy stack of papers, trembling in my grip. How could I have signed a loan for over $1 million and not remember it? My mind raced frantically, tearing through my memories. I thought about the dates printed on the top of the loan agreement. July of last year. 6 months ago. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to remember where I was in July. And then the memory hit me with the brutal force of a swinging hammer. In early July, I had undergone bilateral cataract surgery. The doctor operated on both eyes during the same week. For 7 straight days, I was completely blind, my eyes heavily bandaged. I was confined to my bed, relying entirely on heavy prescription painkillers. I was helpless, disoriented, and completely dependent on my family for survival. The vivid image of my bedroom materialized in my mind. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Derek was supposedly away on business. Monica had come over to check on me. I remembered the overpowering smell of her expensive floral perfume. I remembered the falsely comforting tone of her voice as she brought me soup. And then I remembered the sharp rustling sound of paper being unfolded. She sat on the edge of my bed, She claimed she found urgent paperwork from my medical insurance provider. Just some routine Medicare waiver forms, Harrison, she had said sweetly. Derek needs them signed today so your insurance coverage does not lapse. Let me help you out. I remembered the cool feeling of the pen she pressed into my trembling hand. Because I could not see a single thing, she gently took my wrist, guiding my hand to the exact spots where I needed to sign. I trusted her implicitly. She was my daughter-in-law. I signed my name 3 separate times, believing I was securing my medical coverage. I stood in the sterile county office, staring blindly at the document as the horrific reality washed over me. Those were definitely not my Medicare waivers. Monica had brought bank loan documents into my bedroom. While I lay in the dark in agonizing pain, she carefully guided my hand to sign away the only home I had left. They used my temporary blindness to steal my life's work. I had not just been robbed blindly. I had unknowingly participated in my own financial execution. I had literally signed my own death warrant. I walked out of the King County Administration Building like a ghost. The freezing wind whipped off Puget Sound, biting through my canvas jacket, but I could not feel the cold. All I could feel was the phantom sensation of a pen in my hand, guided by the soft, perfumed grip of my daughter-in-law. I climbed back into my Ford pickup, my heavy boots feeling like they were made of lead. I did not turn the key right away. I just sat behind the steering wheel, gripping it until my knuckles turned white. They had planned this perfectly. They waited for the exact moment I was physically incapacitated. They weaponized my trust and my temporary blindness. But anger alone would not save my home. I needed facts. I needed to know exactly where my money went. I started the engine, threw the truck into drive, and headed straight for the main branch of my bank in downtown Seattle. The drive was a blur of gray concrete and flashing traffic lights. My mind was operating with a cold, terrifying clarity. If Derek had taken out a $1.2 million line of credit, that money had to go somewhere. The county clerk said the account was in default, meaning Derek had already drained the funds and stopped making the monthly interest payments. I needed the disbursement records. I pulled into the bank parking lot, the tires screeching slightly on the damp pavement. I walked through the heavy glass doors, bypassing the regular teller line, and marched directly toward the branch manager's office. I have banked with these people for 30 years. They know me. They know my face, and they know the size of the accounts I built from decades of hard labor. The branch manager, a man named Richard, who usually greeted me with a warm smile, looked up from his desk. He saw the expression on my face, and his smile instantly vanished. "Harrison," he said, standing up quickly. "What is wrong?" I stepped into his office and closed the heavy glass door behind me, sealing us in quiet privacy. "I need the complete wire transfer history and disbursement records for the home equity line of credit attached to my property," I said, my voice dangerously low and steady. Richard swallowed hard, gesturing for me to sit down. I did not sit. I stood over his desk, waiting. He nervously typed into his computer, the clicking of the keys sounding like a ticking clock in the quiet room. It took him a few minutes to authorize the printing of the secure documents. The printer hummed, sliding out 3 crisp sheets of paper. Richard gathered them, stapled the corner, and handed them to me across the desk. I took the papers, my eyes immediately scanning the columns of dates, authorization codes, and dollar amounts. I fully expected to see the name of Derek's tech consulting firm. I thought he had stolen the money to prop up his fake corporate lifestyle. Or perhaps I would see the name of Monica's failing lifestyle brand, a desperate injection of cash to keep her ridiculous social media facade alive. But as I read the payee information, my confusion turned into a deep, chilling horror. The $1.2 million had not gone into any domestic business account. It had not been spent on luxury cars or real estate. The entire amount had been drained in just 3 massive tranches. The first wire was for $400,000, initiated just 2 days after my eye surgery. The second and third wires followed over the next 2 weeks, each for exactly $400,000. And the recipient for all 3 massive transfers was a single offshore holding company. The name printed in bold black letters on the bank statement read Apex Global Crypto. I read the name over and over again, trying to make sense of it. Apex Global Crypto. It was a digital currency exchange based somewhere outside of federal banking jurisdictions. I looked up at Richard. "Do you know what this company is?" asked my voice barely above a whisper. Richard looked at his screen, his face pale. "It is an unregulated offshore cryptocurrency exchange, Harrison. We flagged the transfers as highly suspicious when they were initiated 6 months ago, but the authorizations were perfectly cleared. The digital signatures matched your profile, and the two-factor authentication went directly to the registered phone number on the account." My blood ran completely cold. The registered phone number. Derek had set up the loan, changed the contact information to his own phone, authorized the offshore wires, and then bypassed the bank's security protocols. He had not just stolen my money to buy a boat or save a failing business. He had funneled $1.2 million into an untraceable offshore digital black hole. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. Derek was not just a greedy, entitled son stealing his inheritance early. This was something much darker. You do not move over $1 million into an unregulated offshore crypto exchange in staggered, perfectly divided tranches unless you are trying to hide it from the federal government. He was involved in a massive wire fraud operation, or worse, he was laundering money for a criminal organization. He had used his own father's home, the house I built with my bare hands, to fund a federal crime. I folded the bank statements and slid them into the inside pocket of my jacket. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together. He had stolen the money, lost it, and now the bank was coming to foreclose on my home. Derek was planning to just walk away, leaving me to take the fall for a massive federal offense. He thought I would quietly pack my bags and let him put me in a nursing home. He was dead wrong. The war had escalated. I was ready. I walked slowly out of the heavy, cold glass doors of the bank and stepped back into the freezing, bitter Seattle air. The world around me was moving at its normal pace. Cars were pulling into the parking lot. People were walking by with coffee cups in their hands, laughing and talking on their phones, completely unaware that my entire universe had just been shattered into a million jagged pieces. I moved mechanically, my heavy work boots carrying me across the damp asphalt until I reached my battered Ford pickup truck. I opened the door, climbed inside, and slammed it shut, sealing myself inside the cold, quiet cabin. I did not even attempt to put the metal key into the ignition. I just sat there, staring blankly through the windshield at the gray, overcast sky. The bank statements folded neatly in my jacket pocket felt like a block of lead pressing directly against my heart. I reached in, pulled them out, and laid them on the passenger seat. I stared at the name of the offshore cryptocurrency exchange printed in bold, black ink. It was entirely real. It was not a nightmare I could wake up from. For the first few minutes, I felt absolutely nothing. It was a deep, terrifying numbness, like the shock that hits your body right after a terrible physical injury, right before the agony actually registers. And then slowly the numbness began to fade, replaced by a crushing, suffocating weight that settled deep inside my chest. I gripped the steering wheel with both hands, squeezing the worn leather until my knuckles ached. My vision began to blur. The tears came without warning. They were hot and fast, streaming down my weathered face, dropping onto my canvas jacket. I am a man who has endured a lot of pain in my 70 years on this earth. I have buried my beloved wife. I have broken bones on construction sites. I have faced poverty and hunger. But none of that compared to the sheer, unadulterated agony of this betrayal. I bowed my head, resting my forehead against the cold steering wheel, and I wept. I was not crying for the money. Money is just paper and numbers on a screen. I have lost money before, and I have always found a way to earn it back with the sweat of my brow and the strength of my back. I was crying for my son. I was mourning the boy who used to run down the driveway to greet me when I came home covered in sawdust. I remembered his bright eyes when I taught him how to ride a bicycle. I remembered the way he held his mother's hand when she was lying in her hospital bed. I had worked my entire life to give him everything I never had. I wanted him to be educated, successful, and safe. I never wanted him to know the struggle of living paycheck to paycheck. But in my desperate attempt to give him a perfect life, I had somehow failed to teach him the value of a soul. The boy I raised was dead. He had been swallowed whole by a monster made of greed, entitlement, and unimaginable cruelty. The man wearing those expensive Italian suits, the man who smiled at me while secretly plotting to throw me out on the street to face federal charges, was a complete stranger. I sat in the truck and let myself grieve for that lost boy. I let the sorrow wash over me completely, draining my spirit. I cried until there were simply no tears left to shed. The silence in the cab was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. I lifted my head and looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My eyes were red and swollen. My face looked ancient, defeated, and broken. Is this how my story ends? Is this how Harrison Bennett goes out? As a pathetic, clueless old man who gets swindled by his own flesh and blood and quietly fades away into a cheap nursing home. A deep, primal heat began to rise in my chest. The crushing sadness slowly began to evaporate, burning away under the intense, rising fire of a cold, calculated rage. I reached up and wiped the dampness from my cheeks with the rough back of my hand. The tears were gone. They would be the very last tears I ever shed for Derek. I am a builder. I have spent my entire adult life looking at broken, unstable structures and figuring out exactly how to tear them down safely so I can build something stronger in their place. My family was now a rotten structure. The foundation was completely infested with lies, theft, and malicious intent. You cannot just patch a foundation like that. You cannot paint over the cracks and hope it holds together for a few more years. You have to take a sledgehammer to it. You have to demolish it completely, right down to the bedrock, no matter how much it hurts to swing the hammer. Derek thought I was weak. He thought my love for him was a blindfold that he could use to lead me straight to the slaughterhouse. He had weaponized his role as my son. But he forgot who he was dealing with. I was not about to become a victim in my own life story. I reached over to the passenger seat and picked up the bank statements. I folded them perfectly and placed them carefully into the glove compartment, locking it with a sharp, echoing click. I placed both of my hands firmly on the steering wheel, taking one last deep breath to center my focus. Blood makes you related, but loyalty makes you family. If you agree with that statement, please hit the subscribe button right now, because I was about to teach my arrogant son a brutal, unforgiving lesson in loyalty he would never forget. I turned the key in the ignition, and the heavy engine of my Ford pickup roared to life, matching the newfound fire burning in my chest. I pulled out of the bank parking lot and merged onto the busy downtown streets, heading toward the financial district. I was not going home. Going home meant sitting in a house that was no longer mine, waiting for a foreclosure notice to become a reality. Instead, I drove to the one man in Seattle who could help me turn this nightmare into a trap. Bradley Pierce is not just a lawyer. He is a ruthless, cold-blooded civil litigation attorney who has spent the last 40 years dismantling massive corporations and destroying corrupt executives in the courtroom. He is also my oldest friend. We served in the military together before he went to law school, and I started framing houses. Bradley knows my heart, and more importantly, he knows exactly how to fight dirty when the law alone is not enough. I parked my truck outside his sleek, glass-fronted office building and took the elevator to the top floor. His secretary recognized me immediately and waved me through the heavy oak doors of his private office. Bradley was sitting behind his massive mahogany desk, reviewing a stack of legal briefs. He looked up, adjusting his silver-framed glasses. When he saw the expression on my face, he dropped his pen. "Harrison," he said, standing up quickly, "you look like you just walked through a war zone. What happened?" I did not say a word. I walked over to his desk, pulled the copied foreclosure notice and the bank statements from my jacket pocket, and laid them flat on the polished wood. "Read them," I said, my voice rough and exhausted. Bradley picked up the papers. I watched his eyes scan the King County foreclosure notice first. His brow furrowed in confusion. Then he picked up the bank disbursement records. As he read the name of the offshore cryptocurrency exchange and the staggering sum of $1.2 million, his face turned completely pale. He looked up at me, his sharp blue eyes filled with absolute shock. "Harrison," he whispered, lowering the papers slowly back onto the desk. "Tell me you did not authorize these wire transfers. Tell me you did not mortgage your home for magic internet money." I sat down heavily in the leather chair across from him. I told him everything. I told him about the New Year's Eve toast, the hidden briefcase, the sweaty handprint on the kitchen counter, and the chilling realization of what Monica had made me sign while I was recovering from my cataract surgery. I laid out the entire timeline, connecting the dots between my temporary blindness, the forged intent of the loan, and the massive offshore wires. Bradley listened in absolute silence. He did not interrupt. He just let me pour out the devastating truth. When I finally finished speaking, the silence in the office was suffocating. Bradley took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "The sheer audacity of this crime is staggering," he finally said, his voice laced with a dangerous anger. "They weaponized your medical vulnerability to steal your equity and launder it offshore." He grabbed his office phone, his fingers hovering over the keypad. "I am calling the local field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation right now. We are going to have Derek and Monica arrested before the sun goes down." I reached across the desk and slammed my hand down over the receiver, stopping him from dialing the numbers. "No," I said firmly. Bradley looked at me as if I had lost my mind. "Harrison, this is federal wire fraud, elder abuse, and international money laundering. The FBI will tear his life apart. That is exactly what we want." "If we call them right now, Derek will win," I explained, leaning closer. "Think about it from a legal perspective, Bradley. I signed the documents. My signature is legally notarized. If the FBI knocks on his door today, Derek will look them dead in the eye and say that I fully authorized the crypto investment. He will say that I am 70 years old, my mind is failing, and I simply forgot about the loan. He will play the role of the tragic, loving son whose father is suffering from dementia. And without solid proof of his malicious intent, without a confession, it will turn into a messy, endless civil dispute. The bank will still take my house, and Derek will walk away free, claiming it was all just a tragic misunderstanding." Bradley slowly pulled his hand away from the phone. He leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. He hated it, but he knew I was absolutely right. The legal system requires more than just suspicion. It requires undeniable, irrefutable proof. "So what is your play, old friend?" Bradley asked, a slow, predatory smile beginning to form on his face. "Because I know that look in your eyes. You do not just want your money back. You want to destroy him. We need him to dig his own grave so deep that no expensive corporate lawyer can ever pull him out. We need to legally protect whatever remaining assets I have left, so he cannot drain my pension accounts next. And then we need to bait him into exposing his true intentions on a permanent record." Bradley pulled a fresh yellow legal pad toward him and grabbed his silver pen. "We are going to build an absolute fortress around your finances today," he said, his cold blue eyes narrowing with a fierce, unwavering determination. "And then we are going to set a trap so completely flawless that your son will walk right into it with a confident smile on his face. Let us go to war, my very old friend. We will make him regret the day he ever crossed you." I left the lawyer's office that afternoon with a very clear, very dangerous plan in mind. The hardest part of a war is not the final battle. The hardest part is the waiting. It is the agonizing discipline required to smile at your enemy while you are quietly digging a pit for them to fall into. Over the next 2 weeks, I had to transform myself. I had to become the very thing Derek wanted me to be. I had to become a helpless, senile, broken old man. It was the most humiliating performance of my entire life, but it was absolutely necessary. The bait had to be perfect. The illusion of my declining mental health had to be so convincing that Derek would feel entirely safe to proceed with his malicious timeline. I started small. I would call him in the middle of the workday and ask him questions about events that happened a decade ago, pretending they had just occurred. But the real performance began on a freezing Tuesday morning. It was exactly 2 a.m. when I picked up my phone and dialed his number. I let it ring until his sleepy, irritated voice answered. I made my voice tremble with genuine-sounding panic. I asked him where his mother was, claiming she was supposed to be home from the grocery store hours ago. The line went completely dead for a few seconds. He finally spoke, his voice laced with forced patience, reminding me that she had passed away 5 years ago and telling me to go back to sleep. I let out a long, confused sigh, apologizing profusely, and hung up the phone. I sat in the dark, my heart completely steady. He had bought it. He truly believed my mind was beginning to fracture. 3 days later, I escalated the act. I went to a local grocery store where I knew Derek and Monica often shopped for their expensive organic produce. I loaded my cart, went to the checkout line, and inserted my debit card. When the machine asked for my personal identification number, I purposefully entered the wrong digits 3 times in a row. The machine locked my card. I put on a spectacular show of confusion and mild distress. I asked the cashier to call my son, giving her his direct number. When Derek arrived 20 minutes later, he found me sitting on a bench near the entrance, staring blankly at my wallet. He paid for the groceries, his face a perfect mask of concern for the public eye, but his grip on my arm was tight and impatient as he led me to his car. The culmination of this bitter performance happened the following weekend. Derek and Monica decided to visit the lake house under the guise of checking on my declining health. They brought a catered lunch, playing the roles of the devoted, loving children. I sat in my old leather recliner in the living room, a blanket draped over my knees, staring out the window at the gray waters of the lake. I barely touched my food. I responded to their questions with delayed, vague answers. I was watching them carefully through the reflection in the glass patio doors. While Monica was clearing the plates and Derek was pouring himself a glass of my expensive bourbon, they thought I was completely zoned out. They thought I was lost in the fog of dementia. But my mind was sharper than it had ever been. I watched their reflection in the glass. Monica walked up behind Derek, wrapping her arms around his waist. She leaned her head against his shoulder. I saw Derek turn his head slightly and look at her. And then I saw it. The look. It was a shared, silent communication of absolute victory. A smug, triumphant smirk spread across his face. Monica smiled back, her eyes gleaming with predatory greed. They were celebrating. They were looking at me, the man who had given them everything, and they were rejoicing in my supposed mental collapse. They believed that the stress of the hidden foreclosure notice was finally breaking my mind. They thought their theft was now perfectly shielded by my senility. If I could not remember what year it was, I certainly could not testify in a federal court about a fraudulent loan. Their arrogance was radiating off them like heat from a furnace. They felt untouchable. They thought they were the smartest people in the room playing a game of chess while I was stumbling around in the dark. But they did not realize I had already flipped the board. I sat in my chair, continuing to stare out the window, forcing my face to remain entirely blank. Let them celebrate, I thought to myself. Let them drink my bourbon and smile their wicked, hollow smiles. Their joy would make the impending trap that much more devastating. I focused on the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Every second that passed was another second closer to their absolute ruin. I listened to the soft clinking of the glasses as they toasted silently to their impending wealth. I remembered how hard I had worked to buy that very bourbon, saving it for special occasions for moments of true family celebration. Now it was being used to wash down the bitter taste of their betrayal. I closed my eyes, letting my head loll slightly to the side, perfecting the image of an exhausted, confused elder. Monica walked over and placed a cold hand on my shoulder, asking if I was feeling all right. I slowly opened my eyes and told her I was just tired, letting my voice crack perfectly. Derek walked over, looking down at me with a sickening expression of fake pity, promising to put me in a safe place soon. I let them enjoy their grand illusion. I let them leave the house that afternoon feeling like absolute conquerors. The opportunity to turn my home into a surveillance fortress arrived 3 days later. Derek and Monica had decided to stay at the lake house for the long weekend, claiming they wanted to keep a close eye on my failing health. In reality, they were just using my home as a free luxury hotel while they finalized their plans to steal the remaining equity and disappear. On Saturday evening, they informed me they had reservations at an exclusive downtown steakhouse. They told me to go to bed early, locking the front door behind them as they left for their expensive dinner. The moment I heard the heavy deadbolt slide into place, the fragile, confused old man vanished. I stood up from my recliner, my posture straightening, my eyes sharp and focused. I moved quickly to the hallway closet, reaching up to the top shelf, where I had hidden a heavy cardboard box earlier that week. Inside the box was thousands of dollars worth of professional-grade motion-activated audio recording surveillance equipment. The lawyer had arranged for a private investigator to discreetly purchase the gear. These were not cheap consumer cameras. They were tiny, high-definition lenses, disguised as ordinary household objects, capable of capturing every whisper and every shadow. I had exactly 3 hours before they returned from dinner. I did not waste a single second. I carried the heavy box into my private study. This was the room where all my important financial documents were stored, the room I knew they would search the moment they thought I was asleep. I took out a small black camera, designed to look exactly like the spine of a leather-bound book. I wedged it perfectly between 2 heavy volumes of architecture encyclopedias on the shelf directly facing my desk. I ran the micro-wiring down the back of the bookcase, plugging it into a hidden outlet. I tested the feed on my secure tablet. The image was crystal clear, capturing the entire room and the surface of my desk perfectly. Next, I moved to the main living room. This was the most critical location. This was where they drank, where they argued, and where they plotted their crimes in hushed tones. The ceiling in the living room was high, featuring a massive, intricate crystal chandelier that I had installed myself 20 years ago. I dragged a heavy wooden stepladder from the garage, placing it directly beneath the fixture. My joints ached, protesting the sudden physical strain, but adrenaline pushed the pain aside. I climbed the ladder carefully, carrying a tiny dome-shaped lens no bigger than a marble. I spent the next 40 minutes carefully weaving the camera into the dense crystal droplets and brass wiring of the chandelier. It was painstaking work. My fingers cramped and sweat stung my eyes, but I forced myself to be perfectly precise. The lens had to be entirely invisible from the ground, yet perfectly angled to capture the main seating area. Once the living room camera was secured, I moved to the kitchen, installing a final hidden lens inside the decorative molding above the marble cabinets. I synced all 3 cameras to the encrypted application on my tablet. The audio receptors were incredibly sensitive, designed to pick up even the faintest whispers. I spent the next hour carefully wiping away any footprints, putting the stepladder back in the garage, and ensuring the house looked completely undisturbed. While I was just finishing hiding the empty cardboard box in the bottom of the outdoor trash bin, when the sudden sharp crunch of tires on gravel echoed through the freezing night air. My heart slammed against my ribs. I looked at my watch. It had only been 2 hours. They were home an hour early. I heard the distinct beep of the electric car locking outside. I was standing in the dark hallway, breathing heavily, my heart racing with a sudden surge of panic. If they caught me fully dressed, sweating and moving with the agility of a healthy man, the entire charade would instantly collapse. I heard the jingle of keys outside the heavy oak front door. I had seconds to react. I sprinted silently across the hardwood floor, moving faster than I had in years. I threw my canvas jacket onto the floor of the closet, kicked off my boots, and lunged toward the living room. The lock on the front door clicked loudly. I dove into my leather recliner, snatching the thick woolen blanket from the back of the chair and throwing it hastily over my legs. I let my head drop back against the leather cushion, closing my eyes and forcing my breathing to slow down into a deep, rhythmic pattern. The heavy front door swung open, letting in a blast of freezing wind. They stepped into the entryway, their voices echoing in the quiet house. I lay perfectly still, my muscles screaming from the sudden exertion, a single drop of cold sweat rolling slowly down the side of my face. I heard their footsteps approaching the living room. Monica gasped softly, pointing out that I was passed out exactly where they had left me. Derek let out a low, dark chuckle, noting that I was fading fast and promising they would have me declared incompetent by the end of the month. I kept my eyes firmly shut, my breathing deep and even playing the sleeping fool, while my hidden eyes recorded every single damning word. I lay perfectly still in the leather recliner for what felt like an eternity. I listened to the sound of my son's expensive leather shoes retreating up the wooden staircase, followed by the soft click of the master bedroom door closing. Only then did I slowly open my eyes. The living room was bathed in the pale, cold light of the moon, reflecting off the frozen lake outside. I carefully pushed the heavy woolen blanket off my legs, my joints popping softly in the quiet house. I stood up, ensuring my bare feet made absolutely no sound against the hardwood floor. I crept down the hallway, blending into the shadows like a ghost haunting my own home. Once I was safely inside the small guest bedroom, I quietly locked the door behind me and sat on the edge of the narrow mattress. I reached under the pillow and pulled out my encrypted tablet. I plugged in a pair of wired earbuds, pushing them deep into my ears, and tapped the screen to open the surveillance application. The screen glowed to life, illuminating my weathered face in the dark room. I tapped the feed for the living room camera hidden in the crystal chandelier. The room was empty. Then I switched to the camera concealed in the spine of the architecture book inside my private study. The high-definition night vision lens captured the entire room in a stark greenish hue. And there was Derek. He was not asleep. He was pacing back and forth across the Persian rug, holding his cell phone tightly against his ear. He looked agitated. His usual polished corporate demeanor was gone, replaced by the frantic, nervous energy of a cornered animal. I turned the volume up to maximum, holding my breath, as the highly sensitive microphone picked up his voice with terrifying clarity. He was speaking to someone named Dr. Evans. He was speaking quickly, his words clipped and desperate. "I need you to do the house call by the end of this week," Derek demanded, his voice echoing slightly in the empty study. "I do not care what your usual schedule is. I will double your premium in cash. Just get the paperwork finalized." I sat in the dark bedroom listening intently as he continued to outline his sinister plot. He explained to the doctor that I was suffering from advanced cognitive decline. He spun a tragic tale about how I was wandering the grocery store, how I could not remember the year, and how I was a danger to myself. The doctor on the other end of the line must have asked about the legal necessity of the evaluation, because Derek's response sent a wave of pure, paralyzing ice straight into my veins. "I need you to formally declare him mentally incompetent," Derek said, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "The bank is getting aggressive about the defaulted loan on the house. If they foreclose before I can drain his remaining retirement accounts, the whole plan falls apart. I need full, undeniable medical power of attorney. Once you sign the declaration stating he is incapable of managing his own affairs, I can legally seize his pension, transfer the rest of his mutual funds into my name, and put him in a state-run facility. I just need the legal cover to empty the vaults before the county seizes the property." I stared at the glowing screen of the tablet, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. It is one thing to steal a man's money. It is an entirely different level of evil to steal a man's autonomy. He was not just trying to take the Bellevue Lake House. He was trying to strip me of my basic human rights. A declaration of mental incompetence would mean I could no longer make my own medical decisions. I could no longer access my own bank accounts. I would not even be allowed to hire a lawyer to defend myself. Derek wanted to lock me in a cheap state-funded nursing home, medicate me into submission, and leave me there to rot, while he funded his offshore criminal enterprises with the very last drops of my life savings. I watched him end the phone call, let out a long, satisfied sigh, and walk out of the study. The screen showed the empty, quiet room, but my mind was screaming. The sheer depth of his cruelty was staggering. This was the boy I had carried on my shoulders when he was tired. This was the boy I had worked 80-hour weeks for breathing in toxic dust and ruining my back just so he could go to an expensive university and never have to suffer. And his gratitude was a calculated plan to enslave me in my final years. I turned off the tablet screen, plunging the bedroom back into absolute darkness. The last tiny fragment of paternal love I held for him withered and died in that exact moment. It turned to ash, blowing away in the cold wind of reality. He was no longer my son. He was a dangerous parasite, and I was going to sever him from my life completely. I lay down on the mattress, staring at the ceiling, feeling an absolute terrifying calm wash over me. I knew exactly what I had to do the moment the sun came up. The next morning, Derek and Monica packed their bags and left the lake house early, claiming they had an important brunch engagement in the city. They played the role of the loving children one last time, making sure I was sitting comfortably in my recliner with a cup of warm tea before they walked out the door. The moment their electric car disappeared down the driveway, I stood up, poured the tea down the kitchen sink, and put on my heavy work boots. I grabbed my thick folder of legal documents and drove my Ford pickup straight to downtown Seattle. I was not meeting Bradley Pierce at his corporate law office today. Today, the stakes required absolute, impenetrable legal firepower. I met Bradley on the marble steps of the federal courthouse. He was wearing a dark, tailored suit, holding a thick leather briefcase that contained the instruments of my son's impending destruction. We walked through the heavy security doors, bypassing the crowded public courtrooms, and took a private elevator to the judge's chambers. Bradley had called in a massive favor with a retired federal magistrate who now specialized in complex high-net-worth estate law. We sat in a grand room lined with dark mahogany panels and thousands of ancient leather-bound law books. The air smelled of old paper and serious consequences. The judge, a stern woman with sharp eyes and silver hair, sat behind her massive desk, reviewing the paperwork Bradley had prepared throughout the night. She looked up at me, her expression a mixture of profound respect and quiet sympathy. She asked me if I fully understood the irreversible nature of what I was about to do. I looked her dead in the eye and told her I had never been more certain of anything in my entire 70 years of life. Bradley opened the leather folder and slid a towering stack of thick, watermarked documents across the table. This was not a simple will or a basic property transfer. It was an irrevocable trust. In the eyes of the law, an irrevocable trust is a fortress built of solid titanium. Once signed, it cannot be altered, it cannot be cancelled, and it cannot be pierced by creditors, bad bank loans, or greedy family members. I picked up the heavy brass pen. With slow, deliberate strokes, I signed my name to the bottom of the first page. With that single signature, I legally transferred the title of my $2.5 million Bellevue Lake House entirely out of my name. I signed the next page, transferring every single penny of my remaining retirement funds, my mutual accounts, and my liquid savings into the trust. The beneficiary of this massive fortune was not Derek Bennett. I had instructed Bradley to name a specific, highly rated charity that provided housing and education for foster children in King County. These were children who had been abandoned children who actually needed a safe home and a secure future. I was taking the empire I had built for an ungrateful son and giving it to kids who would cherish the opportunity. The judge notarized each page, her official seal, pressing deep into the thick paper, locking the legal trap into place. When we finally walked out of the federal courthouse, the cold Seattle rain had started to fall, washing the gray streets clean. I stood on the concrete steps, pulling up the collar of my canvas jacket against the freezing wind. I took a deep breath of the damp air. It felt incredibly light. On paper, Harrison Bennett was now a completely penniless man. I owned absolutely nothing. But in reality, I'd never been more powerful. The Bellevue Lake House was now a legal phantom. The bank that issued the fraudulent $1.2 million loan could not foreclose on a property I no longer owned. The county could not collect taxes from an empty shell. And when Derek's crooked psychiatrist finally arrived to declare me mentally incompetent, he would find a man who had zero assets, zero property, and zero money left to control. The trap was perfectly set. The explosive charge was planted deep within the foundation of Derek's fake life. All I had to do now was go home, sit in my leather recliner, and wait for him to confidently push the detonator. I returned to the lake house with a sense of profound peace. I was a man with nothing to his name, yet I held the fate of my enemies entirely in my hands. The next few days passed in a tense, quiet rhythm. Derek and Monica came back to the house to prepare for their extravagant New Year's Eve party. They filled my refrigerator with expensive catering and hired decorators, all while treating me like a ghost haunting my own living room. I played my part flawlessly. I shuffled around in my slippers, stared blankly out the windows, and let them think my mind was rapidly dissolving into nothingness. But every night, when I retreated to my small guest room, I became a hunter. I would lock the door, pull out my encrypted tablet, and watch the high-definition feeds from the hidden cameras. It happened on the night of December 29th, just 2 days before their grand celebration. The house was quiet. The caterers had left for the evening. I was sitting in the dark watching the feed from the living room chandelier. Derek and Monica were standing by the marble fireplace, but their usual arrogant posture was completely gone. The crisp, high-definition audio picked up the frantic, trembling tone of Monica's voice. She was pacing back and forth, her hands pulling at her hair. "They know where we live, Derek," she whispered, her voice cracking with sheer panic. "They sent pictures of the condo. They sent pictures of my car. You told me this was a secure investment. You told me these people were just foreign bankers." Derek was leaning heavily against the mantel, his face buried in his hands. He looked physically sick. The pristine corporate executive was cracking under a massive, invisible pressure. "They are not bankers, Monica," he hissed, his voice tight with fear. "They are an organized syndicate. The exchange was a front. The entire platform collapsed, and the bosses are liquidating everyone who owes them margins. They want the $1.2 million back, plus interest by the end of the month. If we do not pay them, they are going to kill us. They made that perfectly clear." I sat frozen in my dark bedroom, the glowing screen of the tablet reflecting in my eyes. The truth was finally laid bare. Derek had not just been reckless. He had been swimming with sharks, and now the water was filled with blood. He had stolen my equity to play a high-stakes game with international criminals, and he had lost everything. Monica let out a stifled sob, sinking onto the expensive leather sofa. "What do we do?" she cried. "We do not have that kind of cash. The business accounts are completely empty. My credit cards are maxed out. We are ruined." Derek suddenly stood up straight, his eyes darting toward the hallway, making sure I was not awake. He leaned in close to his wife, his face twisted into a mask of desperate cruelty. "We stick to the final plan," he said, his words sharp and deliberate. "We do not need to pay them back. We just need to disappear. The offshore accounts in Geneva are already set up under the shell company. We have exactly $400,000 left in the hidden domestic trust. That is our escape fund." "But what about your father?" Monica asked, her voice trembling. "What about the house?" Derek let out a cold, venomous scoff. "To hell with the old man," he snapped. "We let the bank foreclose on his house. They are already preparing the final eviction notice. When the sheriffs arrive to lock the doors, the cops will just think he went crazy and ran away. We will leave his wallet and his keys on the kitchen counter to make it look like his dementia finally took over, and he wandered into the woods. By the time anyone realizes what actually happened, we will be untouchable. We take the remaining cash and flee to Switzerland by January 2nd. We leave him behind to take the fall for the defaulted loan, and we start over in Europe. The audio recording captured every single syllable with absolute, undeniable clarity. It was a flawless, legally binding confession to elder abuse, financial fraud, and a conspiracy to flee international jurisdiction. I reached out with a perfectly steady hand and pressed the save button on the application. The file immediately encrypted and backed up to a secure cloud server. I did not feel anger anymore. I did not feel sadness. I felt the cold, mechanical satisfaction of a steel trap snapping completely shut. My son had just handed me the rope to hang him with, and he had tied the noose himself. I forwarded the encrypted video file directly to Bradley Pierce's private email server. I watched the progress bar load across the screen, a small green line moving steadily from left to right. 1%, 10%, 50%. With every passing second, Derek's grand illusion was being dismantled piece by piece. When the screen finally flashed a notification confirming the successful transfer, I let out a long, slow breath. The sheer weight of the last 6 months, the agonizing betrayal, the fear of losing my home, it all began to lift off my shoulders. I was no longer a victim waiting for the executioner. I was the architect of their downfall. I lay back on my narrow mattress and stared up at the ceiling. The house was quiet again, save for the distant sound of the winter wind howling off the dark waters of the lake. Somewhere down the hall, my son was likely tossing and turning in his sleep, haunted by the violent threats of offshore criminals and dreaming of his cowardly escape to the Swiss Alps. He thought he had outsmarted the world. He thought he could sacrifice his own flesh and blood to save his own skin. But he had completely underestimated the quiet, relentless patience of a man who had built everything from nothing. I closed my eyes and allowed myself to drift into a deep, dreamless sleep. For the first time since I discovered the foreclosure notice hidden in his leather briefcase, I slept with absolute peace. The evidence was secured. The trap was locked. There was absolutely nothing left to do but wait for the sun to rise and watch the magnificent destruction unfold. This brings us full circle. We are back at the morning of January 1st. The grand New Year's Eve party had ended hours ago. The guests had all stumbled to their expensive cars and driven back to their hollow corporate lives. The vicious toast my son had made, hoping this would be my last year in this house, still echoed faintly in the corners of the grand living room. But the sting of his words was completely gone. I was sitting in my favorite leather armchair by the large glass patio doors, holding a simple ceramic mug filled with steaming black coffee. The winter sun was just beginning to rise over the horizon, casting a pale, beautiful golden light across the frozen surface of the lake. The house was freezing, but the warmth radiating from the coffee mug in my calloused hands was all I needed. I took a slow sip, letting the bitter, rich liquid wake my senses. I was entirely calm. It was the deep, unsettling calm that settles over the ocean right before a massive hurricane makes landfall. I looked around the pristine living room. I had spent hours cleaning up their mess in the middle of the night, restoring order to my fortress. I looked up at the intricate crystal chandelier hanging from the high ceiling, knowing the tiny invisible camera hidden among the glass droplets had done its job perfectly. Derek and Monica had no idea what was currently in motion. They were sleeping upstairs, dreaming of their flight to Geneva scheduled for the very next day. They did not know that 48 hours ago, the moment Bradley Pierce received my video file, he did not hesitate. He compiled the irrevocable trust documents, the offshore banking wire records, the property tax defaults, and the crystal-clear audio confession, and he marched them straight into the Seattle field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He bypassed the local police entirely. He went directly to the federal agents who specialize in international wire fraud and organized crime. Bradley had called me on a secure line yesterday afternoon, confirming that federal warrants had been officially signed by a judge. The wheels of justice were not just turning. They were speeding directly toward my front door with devastating momentum. I heard the heavy wooden floorboards creak on the staircase. I did not turn my head. I kept my eyes fixed on the beautiful sunrise over the water. Derek slowly descended the stairs. He was wearing an expensive silk robe, rubbing his temples, clearly nursing a massive hangover from the $200 champagne he had consumed the night before. He walked into the living room, his bare feet padding softly against the oak floor. He stopped when he saw me sitting in the armchair. I could see his reflection in the patio glass. He immediately forced his face into that familiar, sickening mask of fake affection. He painted on a bright, tight smile, hiding the absolute panic that was undoubtedly tearing his stomach apart. "Good morning, Dad," he said, his voice dripping with forced cheerfulness. "You are up early today. How are you feeling?" I slowly turned my head to look at him. I studied his face. I looked at the dark circles under his eyes, the slight tremble in his fingers, the tense posture of a man who knows his life is hanging by a single fraying thread. He thought he was looking at a senile old fool, but I was looking at a dead man walking. "I am feeling incredibly well, Derek," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly flat and steady. "I slept better last night than I have in a very long time." Derek walked over to the kitchen island and began preparing his artisanal espresso, just as he had done on that morning so many days ago, when he lied to my face about the software glitch. He kept his back to me, humming a soft, nervous tune. "We have a big day tomorrow, Dad," he called out over the grinding noise of the coffee machine. "Monica and I have to fly out to Europe for a massive corporate consulting gig. We will be gone for a few weeks, but do not worry. We have arranged for some nice people from the state to come check on you while we are away. They are going to help you manage the house and your medical needs. It is for your own good." He was talking about the state-funded facility. He was actively setting the stage to abandon me fully, believing the foreclosure agents would arrive the moment his plane took off. He thought his master plan was executing flawlessly. He thought he had outsmarted the criminal syndicate, the federal government, and his own father in one fell swoop. I took another slow sip of my black coffee. I did not argue with him. I did not scream, and I did not confront him with the truth. There was no need to warn a rat that the cage was about to drop. "That sounds like a wonderful plan, son," I said softly, staring deeply into his dark, lying eyes. "I am sure everything is going to work out exactly the way it is supposed to." Derek smiled, a genuine flicker of relief washing over his face. He thought he had won. He lifted his espresso cup, completely unaware of the flashing red and blue lights that were currently turning onto the long gravel driveway of the lake house. The calm before the storm was officially over. The thunder was finally here. The heavy oak front door of the lake house did not just rattle. It shuddered violently under the sudden rhythmic impact of heavy fists pounding against the thick wood. The sound was deafening, echoing through the cavernous living room like a series of gunshot blasts shattering the absolute peace of the winter morning. I did not flinch. I did not spill a single drop of my black coffee. I remained perfectly still in my leather armchair, letting the deep, resonant booming wash over me. Outside the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, the pale golden light of the beautiful sunrise was violently interrupted. Brilliant flashes of crimson red and blinding cobalt blue began to slice through the morning mist, reflecting fiercely off the frozen surface of the lake and painting the interior walls of my home in frantic, strobing colors. Derek froze completely. He was standing right by the marble kitchen island, his hand hovering over the expensive espresso machine. The soft humming of the coffee grinder ground to an abrupt halt. For a fraction of a second, he looked incredibly annoyed, as if a rude neighbor had interrupted his perfectly curated holiday morning routine. He let out an irritated sigh and turned his head toward the front entryway. But then the flashing red and blue lights caught his eye. The strobing colors danced across his expensive silk robe and illuminated his face. I watched the physical transformation happen in real time. It was a spectacular thing to witness. The arrogant, untouchable corporate executive vanished in the blink of an eye. The minor annoyance on his face melted into absolute paralyzing confusion, and then, as the heavy pounding on the door resumed with even greater force, the color completely drained from his skin. He turned as pale as a sheet of winter ice. He took a tentative step toward the large front window, his bare feet moving hesitantly across the polished hardwood floor. His hands began to tremble so violently that he had to grip the edge of the marble countertop to steady his shifting weight. He leaned forward, pressing his face close to the cold glass to peer out at the long gravel driveway. I did not need to look out the window to know exactly what he was seeing. I had orchestrated every single detail of it. Parked haphazardly across my perfectly manicured front lawn were 4 King County police cruisers, their light bars spinning wildly, casting harsh, terrifying shadows across the frost-covered grass. Positioned directly behind them, blocking any possible route of escape to the main road, was a massive pitch-black, unmarked SUV. The doors of the vehicles were already open. Uniformed officers were swiftly moving to secure the perimeter of the property, jogging toward the back patio to ensure no one could slip away toward the freezing water of the lake. Derek let out a choked, breathless gasp. His chest began to heave as his breathing turned incredibly shallow and frantic. He stumbled backward from the window, his eyes wide with sheer terror. 2 commanding figures stepped out of the unmarked SUV. They were not local police officers. They wore dark tactical pants, heavy boots, and navy blue windbreakers with 3 bright yellow letters printed boldly across the back. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had officially arrived. They walked up the paved walkway toward the front porch with a terrifying synchronized purpose. They did not look like men who were here to ask polite questions about a database error. They looked like men who were here to completely dismantle a criminal enterprise. From the top of the wooden staircase, a sharp, irritated voice pierced the tense silence. "What on earth is all that ridiculous racket?" Monica complained loudly. She was slowly walking down the stairs, tying the belt of her designer velvet robe, her hair wrapped tightly in a silk towel. "Who is banging on the door at this ungodly hour? Tell them to go away, Derek." But as she reached the bottom landing, the flashing red and blue lights illuminated her face. She stopped dead in her tracks. She looked at Derek, who was currently hyperventilating against the kitchen counter, and then she looked toward the front window. Her mouth opened in a silent, horrifying scream. The heavy pounding on the oak door struck again, accompanied by a booming, authoritative voice commanding us to open the door immediately. The panic in the room was palpable. It tasted like cold copper and nervous sweat. Derek looked wildly around the living room, his eyes darting toward the back glass doors, the wooden staircase, the kitchen garage access. He was a trapped animal calculating his 0 chances of survival, realizing with crushing certainty that there were absolutely no exits left. The Swiss Alps were 1,000,000 miles away. The hidden offshore accounts were entirely useless. The reality of his colossal arrogance had finally caught up to him, arriving directly on his doorstep with federal warrants and steel handcuffs. He looked over at me, his eyes wide and pleading, as if expecting me to somehow fix this to shield him from the devastating consequences of his own malicious actions. I simply sat in my chair, holding my warm ceramic mug, watching the magnificent destruction of his carefully constructed lies. I took another slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. I nodded toward the entryway. "You had better answer that, Derek," I said softly. "It is incredibly rude to keep your guests waiting in the freezing cold." He stared at me, his jaw trembling, unable to comprehend the absolute calm in my voice. The pounding struck the door for a 3rd time, rattling the brass hinges I had installed 30 years ago. Federal agents opened the door immediately, the deep voice bellowed from the front porch. Derek swallowed hard, a visible gulp of pure, unfiltered fear. He pushed himself off the marble counter, his legs shaking so badly he looked as though he might collapse right there on the kitchen floor. He took one agonizingly slow step toward the entryway, then another, moving like a condemned man walking toward the gallows. Monica remained frozen on the staircase, clutching the wooden banister with white knuckles, tears of absolute panic already beginning to stream down her perfectly moisturized face. The beautiful, opulent lake house with its expensive champagne bottles and its sweeping views of the water had instantly transformed into an inescapable federal trap. Every single lie they had told, every forged document they had filed, and every cruel joke they had made at my expense was hovering in the air, waiting to crash down upon them. Derek reached the entryway. His trembling hand hovered over the heavy brass deadbolt. He closed his eyes, taking one last desperate breath of freedom, before his fingers finally grasped the cold metal lock. With a loud metallic click, Derek slid the deadbolt back and pulled the heavy oak door open. A blast of freezing winter wind immediately swept into the house, carrying with it the undeniable presence of absolute authority. Standing on the porch were two towering federal agents, their faces completely devoid of any emotion or sympathy. Behind them, the uniformed officers stood with their hands resting cautiously on their heavy duty belts. Derek immediately raised his hands in a placating gesture, plastering a sickening artificial smile onto his pale, sweating face. He fell back on the only weapon he thought he had left in his arsenal. He tried to manipulate them. He tried to play the role of the tragic, responsible son, protecting his broken family from a massive misunderstanding. "Agents, please, there must be some kind of terrible mistake here," Derek stammered, his voice cracking violently under the immense pressure. "Please lower your voices. My father is in the living room right now. He is elderly, and he is severely mentally unwell. He suffers from advanced dementia and gets confused very easily. Whatever financial debts he has stumbled into, whatever catastrophic mistakes he has made with his property documents. I am his son, and I am actively trying to fix it for him. Just give me a moment to explain the situation to my corporate lawyers, and we can clear this all up quietly without stressing his frail heart." It was a brilliant, desperate, and entirely pathetic lie. It was the exact same lie he had rehearsed perfectly in my kitchen weeks ago. But the federal agents did not even blink. They did not care about his cashmere sweater, his expensive silk robe, or his smooth corporate vocabulary. They had not come here to listen to a negotiation. They had come here with a mountain of irrefutable evidence provided by a ruthless civil litigation attorney. The lead agent, a tall man with a thick jaw and cold, calculating gray eyes, stepped squarely across the threshold, invading Derek's meticulously protected personal space. He did not ask permission to enter. He did not offer a polite morning greeting. Derek Bennett, the lead agent, stated, his voice booming through the silent house with terrifying finality. He reached out with lightning speed, grabbing Derek firmly by the shoulder of his expensive silk robe. With a swift, brutal, and highly practiced motion, the agent spun my arrogant son around and slammed him hard against the wooden frame of the doorway. The physical impact shook the walls of the entryway. Derek let out a sharp, pathetic gasp as the breath was knocked completely out of his lungs. His hands were violently yanked behind his back. The sharp, metallic ratcheting sound of heavy steel handcuffs clicking tightly around his wrists echoed loudly through the entire house. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, forgery of legal documents, and international money laundering." The agent recited, his tone as cold and unforgiving as the Seattle winter wind. A piercing, hysterical scream shattered the morning air. Monica collapsed onto the carpeted staircase, burying her face deep into her hands. She wailed a loud, ugly, uncontrollable sound of absolute despair. She knew instantly that her luxurious fake life was entirely over. The designer clothes, the expensive European vacations, the fake social media empire she had built on my stolen money. It was all completely gone, replaced by the horrifying reality of federal accessory charges, prison time, and impending bankruptcy. Two uniformed police officers stepped past the struggling Derek and moved quickly toward the wooden stairs to secure her, barking strict orders for her to remain seated and keep her trembling hands visible. Derek was pinned forcefully against the doorframe, his cheek pressed hard against the cold wood. The polished, untouchable executive was completely gone. He was crying. Real, terrified tears streamed down his face, mixing with the cold sweat on his forehead. He thrashed weakly against the iron grip of the federal agent, but it was absolutely useless. His eyes darted wildly around the chaotic room until they finally locked onto me. I was still sitting peacefully in my leather armchair, the steam rising softly from my black coffee, watching the entire scene unfold with absolute emotional detachment. The arrogant mask he wore for his entire adult life was entirely gone. He reverted instantly to a scared, pathetic child, desperately begging the very father he had tried to destroy just hours before. "Dad." Derek screamed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate, agonizing sob. "Dad, please help me. Tell them. Tell them you signed the home equity line of credit. Tell them you authorized the bank transfers. Tell them you told me to invest the money in the offshore accounts. Please, Dad, you have to tell them the truth right now. Do not let them take me away to prison. I am your son. Please, I am begging you." His pathetic weeping pleas filled the grand living room, echoing off the high ceilings and bouncing off the marble fireplace. He was asking me to commit perjury. He was begging me to step willingly into the dark trap he had dug, to sacrifice my own freedom and my own home to save him from the devastating consequences of his own boundless greed. He stared at me with wide, bloodshot eyes, waiting for the unconditional, paternal love he had weaponized for his entire life to swoop in and rescue him one final time. I slowly lowered my ceramic coffee mug, placing it gently onto the glass side table, without making a single sound. I looked at the federal agents securing the perimeter of my home, and then I looked directly into the terrified, weeping eyes of the monster I had raised. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of anger. I just sat there, breathing in the cold morning air, preparing to deliver the final crushing blow. I slowly stood up from my leather armchair, the soft creak of the upholstery the only sound I made. I did not rush. I took my time, feeling the solid oak floorboards beneath my heavy work boots. Every step I took toward the entryway was a deliberate strike against the empire of lies my son had built. The freezing winter wind was blowing through the open front door, swirling around the grand living room, knocking over an empty champagne flute on the coffee table, but I did not feel the cold. I felt a profound, unwavering heat radiating from deep within my chest. I walked past the marble kitchen island, past the expensive espresso machine that was still dripping hot coffee into a porcelain cup, and stopped just a few feet away from where Derek was pinned against the doorframe. He was a pathetic, broken sight. The expensive silk robe was rumpled and stained with his own terrified sweat. His perfectly styled hair was disheveled, falling across his pale, tear-streaked face. He looked up at me with those wide, begging eyes still clinging to the desperate hope that the father he had spent months trying to destroy would magically shield him from the devastating consequences of his actions. "Tell them, Dad." He whispered, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. "Tell them about the loan. Tell them it was your idea. Please, you have to save me." I looked at him for a long, silent moment. I let the heavy weight of his ultimate betrayal hang in the freezing air just between us. I looked at the federal agents who were watching our exchange with silent, professional intensity, their grips firm on his arms. Then I looked back at the boy I had raised, the boy who had looked me in the eye just hours ago and hoped I would die so he could take my home. "What house, Derek?" I asked, my voice echoing clearly over the sound of Monica sobbing uncontrollably on the wooden staircase. Derek blinked rapidly, his brow furrowing in a pathetic display of complete confusion. He tried to speak, but only a dry, rattling sound came from his throat. His brain was desperately trying to process the absolute calm in my demeanor. I stepped slightly closer, making sure he could see the absolute clarity and intense focus in my eyes. I was no longer the frail, confused old man he had mocked and manipulated. "The house you are standing in does not belong to me," I continued, speaking slowly, so that every single word pierced through his blinding panic. "This house, along with every single penny of my liquid assets, belongs to the King County Children's Trust. I executed an irrevocable legal transfer weeks ago. On paper, I am a completely penniless man. You cannot foreclose on a phantom Derek, and you certainly cannot steal from an empty vault." I watched the devastating realization strike him like a physical blow to the chest. His eyes widened to an impossible size. His jaw went completely slack, his mouth hanging open in shock. The brilliant corporate strategist finally understood that his collateral, his safety net, and his entire escape plan had been entirely erased from existence. But I was not finished. I leaned in just a fraction closer, invading his space. "And as for that $1.2 million home equity line of credit, you owe the private bank," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper. "The one you funneled into an offshore cryptocurrency exchange while I was recovering from eye surgery. The FBI already has the bank records. My lawyer gave them everything 48 hours ago. They found the digital authorization codes. They tracked the internet protocol traces directly back to your personal laptop. They know exactly where the money went, and more importantly, they know exactly who you owe it to." Derek let out a horrifying guttural sound. It was not a word. It was the agonizing sound of a man's soul being completely crushed under the overwhelming weight of his own hubris. He violently shook his head from side to side, denying the horrifying reality that was crashing down upon him. "No," he gasped, choking violently on his own tears. "No, you did not know. You could not have known. You are sick. You are confused. You do not understand what is happening." "I am perfectly healthy, son," I replied calmly, my tone as cold as ice. "My mind is sharper than it has ever been. I knew everything from the very first night I found the foreclosure notice hidden in your leather briefcase. I wiped your sweaty handprint off my counter. I installed high-definition audio recording cameras in the living room chandelier and the study bookshelf while you were out to dinner. I watched you celebrate my supposed mental decline. I listened to your frantic phone call with the crooked psychiatrist. I heard every single word of your plan to leave me here for the police while you and your wife fled to Switzerland with the remaining cash. I handed the encrypted video confession directly to the federal government. The sheer terror that washed over Derek's face is an image that will be burned into my memory for the rest of my life. The final wall of his delusion shattered into a million pieces. He stopped struggling against the federal agents. His knees buckled completely, and if the lead agent had not been holding him upright by the collar, he would have collapsed onto the hardwood floor. He looked at me not as a father, but as a terrifying, calculating stranger who had flawlessly orchestrated his absolute destruction. He realized that for the last month, he had not been the apex predator he thought he was. He had been a blind rat navigating a dark maze that I had built, happily eating the poisoned cheese I had left for him. The lead agent did not give him another moment to speak. He yanked Derek upright with a forceful, highly practiced motion. "Let us go!" "Bennett," the agent growled, pushing Derek firmly out the front door and onto the freezing concrete of the front porch. I stood in the entryway and watched as they marched my son down the long gravel driveway. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated his slumped, utterly defeated posture. He did not look back. He did not say another word. The uniformed police officers pulled a screaming, hysterical Monica down the stairs, ignoring her frantic, tearful demands for a lawyer, and marched her out right behind her husband. I watched as the federal agents shoved Derek roughly into the cramped back seat of the unmarked black SUV. They slammed the heavy door shut, sealing him inside a dark, terrifying new reality. His designer suits, his expensive luxury cars, his hollow corporate prestige, all of it was instantly vaporized permanently, replaced by the cold steel of federal prison bars. I stood alone in the doorway of my beautiful home, listening to the powerful engines of the police cruisers rev up. I watched the caravan of official vehicles slowly turn around and drive away, their sirens mercifully silent, their flashing lights fading slowly into the pale morning mist. The gravel crunched loudly under their heavy tires, and then slowly, the property descended back into absolute, uninterrupted silence. The monster had been completely removed from the house. The agonizing war was officially over. 6 months passed since that freezing January morning. The changing of the seasons brought a slow, methodical rhythm to my days, replacing the chaotic, suffocating dread that had previously consumed my life. The bitter winter winds eventually gave way to the gentle, warm breezes of a Seattle spring, and with that warmth came the final, undeniable closure of the legal battle. I found myself sitting in the familiar mahogany-paneled office of my oldest friend, Bradley Pierce. The heavy wooden desk between us was no longer covered in terrifying foreclosure notices or fraudulent bank statements. Instead, sitting perfectly centered on the polished surface was a single thick manila folder containing the final sentencing report from the federal court. Bradley picked up the document, adjusting his silver-framed glasses. He did not smile, but there was a deep, resonant satisfaction in his eyes. He read the final verdict aloud, his voice steady and official. Derek Bennett was found guilty on all counts. The federal judge did not show a single ounce of leniency. Despite the expensive legal team Derek initially tried to hire, the mountain of evidence we had meticulously gathered proved to be entirely insurmountable. The high-definition video confession, the internet protocol addresses the forged loan documents, and the offshore wire transfers painted a vivid, undeniable picture of a man entirely consumed by his own malicious greed. Because his actions involved defrauding a federally insured bank and laundering the proceeds through an unregulated international syndicate, the mandatory minimums were brutal. My son was sentenced to 12 years in a federal penitentiary. There would be no early parole. There would be no corporate bailout. The man who had worn custom-tailored Italian suits and mocked my calloused hands was now wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit stripped of his title, his wealth, and his freedom. I attended the final sentencing hearing. I sat in the back row of the quiet courtroom watching as the judge delivered the crushing blow. Derek did not look back at me. His shoulders were slumped. His head hung low, the absolute reality of a decade behind bars finally breaking his arrogant spirit. I felt a brief fleeting pang of sorrow, not for the criminal standing before the judge, but for the innocent little boy I used to take fishing on the lake. But that sorrow quickly faded, replaced by the stark realization that the boy was gone forever, and the man who replaced him fully deserved his cage. Monica, on the other hand, experienced a very different kind of destruction. When the federal agents raided their pristine luxury condo in Seattle, they found ample evidence tying her directly to the conspiracy. She was facing severe accessory charges and the terrifying prospect of serving her own lengthy prison sentence. But loyalty among thieves is a fragile, non-existent thing. The moment the federal prosecutors offered her a plea deal, she turned on her husband with breathtaking speed. She provided the investigators with every remaining detail of Derek's offshore accounts, turning over his private ledgers and throwing him completely to the wolves in exchange for her own freedom. She avoided a prison cell, but she did not escape her punishment. The federal government seized absolutely everything they owned to pay back the defrauded bank and settle the immense legal fines. The luxury condo was auctioned off. The sleek electric car was repossessed. Her bank accounts were frozen and entirely drained. The carefully curated fake life she had spent years building on social media shattered overnight. Her followers vanished when the news of the scandal broke, replacing her superficial admiration with public disgrace. Today, the woman who once looked at me with absolute disgust, the woman who complained about the noise of federal agents ruining her morning routine, is completely bankrupt. Bradley hired a private investigator to do one final check on her, just to ensure the loose ends were tied. He handed me a photograph across the desk. It showed Monica standing behind the greasy counter of a rundown diner on the outskirts of the city. She was wearing a stained polyester uniform, her perfectly manicured nails ruined by endless shifts of washing heavy dishes, and serving cheap coffee. She is currently working 60 hours a week just to make the minimum payments on her staggering, insurmountable credit card debt. She traded a life of unearned luxury for a life of grueling, humiliating labor, a perfect and poetic justice for a woman who thought she was entirely above the working class. With the legal dust completely settled, I found myself back where this entire story began. It was a beautiful, quiet summer evening. I was sitting on the wide wooden porch of the Bellevue Lake House, resting in my favorite leather armchair. The sun was setting over the water, painting the sky in breathtaking strokes of purple, orange, and gold. The air smelled of pine needles and fresh rain. The house was peaceful, but it was no longer empty. Over the last few months, the King County Children's Trust had officially taken over the administration of the property. I had worked closely with their board of directors to ensure the transition was seamless. I was allowed to live out the rest of my days in the small guest cottage on the edge of the property, a quiet, simple space that suited my needs perfectly. The main house, the massive $2.5 million fortress I had built with my own two hands, was currently being transformed. It was being renovated to serve as a permanent, safe group home for foster children who had nowhere else to go. As I sat on the porch, I could hear the faint, joyous sounds of children laughing and playing in the large backyard. I watched a group of young boys running across the green lawn, tossing a football back and forth. They were children who had known nothing but hardship, abandonment, and instability. Now they were sleeping in warm beds, eating in a grand kitchen, and living in a home that would never be taken away from them. I watched them play, and for the first time in years, my heart felt completely full. I had lost a son to the dark depths of greed, but I had gained a massive, beautiful family of souls who truly needed the shelter I had built. I kept my dignity, I protected my life's work, and I ensured that my legacy would not be defined by a massive federal crime, but by a profound act of charity. Sitting there listening to the gentle lapping of the water against the wooden dock, I took a deep breath of the cool evening air. I realized that my life was not ending. It was simply turning a new page. I learned a brutal, agonizing lesson over the last 6 months. I learned that you cannot buy loyalty, no matter how much money you spend or how many houses you build, and you cannot love the greed out of a person. Blood might make you related, but it does not guarantee respect, and it certainly does not guarantee a moral compass. Sometimes the people you are supposed to trust the most are the ones holding the knife behind your back. But I also learned that you do not have to be a victim. You do not have to lay down and let toxic family members trample over your life just because you share a last name. I am 70 years old, and my life is just beginning again, this time with absolute peace. If you stood by my side through this journey, if you felt the anger, the betrayal, and the ultimate satisfaction of justice being served, please leave a comment below. Send a super thanks. If this story gave you the courage to stand up to toxic family members in your own life, do not ever let anyone make you feel small in the house you built. Subscribe to the channel, and I will see you in the next story. Stay strong.